Judge Bramwell Ashford leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing across his weathered face as he watched the defendant enter his courtroom. The woman moved with an unsettling composure that immediately irritated him. "Another one thinks she's special, Sentaneka," he muttered to his clerk loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Let's see how special she feels after I'm done with her." The woman in the simple navy blazer and worn flats didn't flinch at his words. She walked to the defendant's table with military precision, her spine straight, her gaze forward. Something about her calm disturbed the judge more than any outburst could have. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges." "Of course she does, they always do." He shuffled through papers with theatrical annoyance. "Let's see here. Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace. Quite the rap sheet for a—" He paused, looking up with mock curiosity. "What did you say your occupation was again?" "Government contractor, Your Honor." Ashford's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The defendant's voice had been steady, professional, but he heard only what he expected to hear. Another excuse, another lie from another criminal trying to sound important. "Government contractor, how wonderfully vague." His eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Well, Miss—" He glanced at his papers with exaggerated confusion. "Miss Cortland, your little contracting days are about to come to an end. In my courtroom, we believe in accountability." What Judge Ashford didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman standing before him commanded more military power than the entire state of Virginia. In exactly 18 minutes, a phone call from the Pentagon would shatter his world into pieces. But first, Sage Cortland had to survive the next 18 minutes. The lock clicks twice, then silence. If you think this story is about to get wild, just wait. What happens next will completely change how you see courtroom justice. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of who they appear to be. 3 days earlier, General Sage Cortland had been preparing for the most critical NATO summit in a decade. Now she stood in aisle 7 of McLean Market, organizing items in her cart with the same methodical precision she used to arrange briefing materials for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Organic vegetables aligned by color and size, canned goods stacked according to weight distribution, habits ingrained by 30 years of military service. The young clerk behind the register watched her approach, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to poorly concealed skepticism. As she began placing items on the conveyor belt, he glanced at the organic produce and cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you know we have regular vegetables in aisle 4, much more affordable." His tone carried the patronizing quality of someone who believed he was being helpful. Sage paused, holding a bundle of organic kale. She'd faced down senators questioning defense budgets, but this simple moment of assumption still stung. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I prefer these." Sure. Just saying, with the economy and all." He shrugged, as if her financial limitations were obvious from her appearance. She paid with cash, a habit from years of operational security, and noted how his eyes widened at the crisp $100 bills. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. Almost. Walking through the affluent suburb of McLean, Virginia, Sage reflected on the strange duality of her current existence. Here, she was invisible, just another woman running errands in civilian clothes. 60 miles away in the Pentagon, her signature could deploy aircraft carriers or redirect satellite surveillance. The disconnect felt surreal. Her sister's neighborhood embodied the peculiar tension of modern military communities. Sprawling colonial houses owned by defense contractors sat next to modest ranchers housing enlisted families. The divide wasn't just economic, it was cultural, racial, generational. At her sister's house, she encountered Mrs. Caldwell from next door, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes when speaking to certain neighbors. "Oh, you're Maya's sister. I heard you were visiting." The pause before visiting carried weight. "What kind of work do you do, dear?" "Government contractor," Sage replied, using her standard civilian cover. "How nice. Temporary work, I imagine. It's so hard to find stable employment these days." The implication was clear. People like you don't have real careers. Sage had learned long ago that correcting such assumptions often created more problems than it solved. Better to let people reveal their character through their words than to shock them into temporary politeness with the truth. That evening, she attended a homeowners association meeting at Maya's request. The topic was neighborhood security, specifically concerns about transient populations affecting property values. Sage sat in the back listening to coded language that danced around explicit bias while maintaining plausible deniability. When the discussion turned to lighting improvements, Sage raised her hand. "The proposed lighting pattern creates significant blind spots near the playground. Security cameras would be more effective if positioned." "And you are?" The association president, a man named Bradford, interrupted with barely concealed irritation. Sage Cortland, I'm visiting my sister on Maple Street. Are you a security professional? I have experience with risk assessment. Murmurs rippled through the room. Experience could mean anything. A weekend seminar, an online course, years of expertise. The assumption, as always, leaned toward the minimal. Well, Ms. Cortland, we appreciate civilian input, but we're working with actual security consultants. Bradford's dismissal was polite but firm. The suggestion she'd offered, based on lessons learned from protecting forward operating bases in 3 war zones, was noted and ignored. The next morning brought another layer of subtle indignity. At the dry cleaner, the elderly proprietor struggled with his computer system, repeatedly clicking through menus while muttering about technology. Excuse me, you're tagged as unemployed in our system. Is that still accurate? The question, asked loudly enough for other customers to hear, carried the weight of judgment. Sage had been tagged unemployed because her listed occupation, federal employee, didn't fit their drop-down menu categories. The tag is incorrect. I'm employed. Oh, good for you. Find something recently? The proprietor's enthusiasm felt patronizing, as if employment was a stroke of luck rather than a reflection of capability. At the post office, another assumption. A young postal worker examined the address on a package being delivered to Maya's house, official mail with military markings. This is for you? Yes. You picking it up for someone else? This looks like military stuff. The implication stung more than it should have. The idea that she might legitimately receive official military correspondence was apparently impossible to imagine. These microaggressions accumulated like paper cuts, individually minor, collectively devastating. Each assumption chipped away at her sense of belonging in spaces where her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. Later that afternoon, she witnessed something that would change everything. Walking back from the hardware store where she'd purchased items for Maya's kitchen renovation, Sage heard shouting from the parking lot behind Murphy's Cafe. A man's voice, angry and escalating, mixed with a woman's pleas. She approached carefully, her training automatically cataloging details. White male, approximately 6'2", wearing a business suit but disheveled. His face was flushed with alcohol or rage, possibly both. The woman, blonde, petite, wearing what appeared to be work clothes, was pressed against a car, trying to create distance. You embarrassed me in there, he snarled, jabbing his finger toward the restaurant. Making me look like an idiot in front of my colleagues. David, please. I just asked you to lower your voice. People were staring. They were staring because you were being dramatic. Just like always. Several people had gathered at the edges of the parking lot, their phones out, recording. The modern version of rubbernecking, capturing trauma for social media consumption rather than intervening. Sage assessed the situation with professional detachment. The man showed classic signs of escalating domestic violence, invasion of personal space, verbal intimidation, physical positioning to prevent escape. The woman's body language screamed fear disguised as appeasement. Training dictated intervention protocols, but civilian laws complicated the equation. She wasn't a sworn officer here. She had no badge, no authority, no backup. But she had a moral obligation. The man's hand moved to the woman's shoulder, gripping tight enough to make her wince. That gesture, the claiming of ownership through force, triggered something primal in Sage's protective instincts. Excuse me, her voice cut through the parking lot noise with command authority. Is everything all right here? The man spun toward her, his face contorting with irritation. Mind your business, lady. This doesn't concern you. Sir, I need you to step back and give the lady some space. You need me too? His laugh was ugly, dismissive. Who the hell do you think you are? The woman, Brooke, she would later learn, looked at her with desperate gratitude. That look sealed Sage's commitment. She'd seen the same expression on civilian faces in war zones, the hope that someone with power might actually use it for protection rather than exploitation. I'm someone asking you to step back. Get lost before you get hurt. The threat was clear and several bystanders shifted uncomfortably. Violence was coming. Everyone could feel it building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. That's when Officer Trent Holbrook's patrol car rounded the corner. Holbrook was a 15-year veteran of suburban law enforcement, a man whose worldview had been shaped by television cop shows and departmental culture that valued order over justice. He saw 3 things: a white man in a business suit, a white woman against a car, and a black woman standing with apparent aggression between them. His training should have led him to de-escalate, to gather information, to assess threats based on behavior rather than appearance. Instead, he saw what his biases told him to see. Ma'am, step away from them, now. The command was directed at Sage, even though she stood 3 feet from the actual aggressor. "Officer, this man was physically intimidating." I said step back. Holbrook's hand moved to his belt, a gesture pregnant with threat. David straightened, sensing an ally. "Thank God you're here. This woman just started harassing us for no reason." Sage felt reality tilting. The actual perpetrator was now being treated as the victim, while she, the Good Samaritan, was being positioned as the threat. "Sir, that's not accurate. I observed signs of domestic—" "Ma'am, put your hands where I can see them." The absurdity was staggering. In 60 seconds, she'd gone from trying to protect someone to being treated as a criminal. The woman she'd tried to help, Brooke, was staring in shocked silence, recognizing the injustice but paralyzed by the officer's authority. Speaking of legal protection, have you ever wondered if you could defend yourself better in court? Legal Shield offers 24/7 access to attorneys for less than $1 a day. Whether it's traffic tickets, identity theft, or family matters, you'll have professional legal consultation at your fingertips. Don't wait until you need it. Get protected now with Legal Shield. Officer Holbrook's partner, Officer Shaw, arrived as backup. Shaw was younger, less experienced, but equally susceptible to the same visual assumptions. Two officers, one apparent aggressor in a suit being treated as a victim, and one black woman being treated as a threat. "What's the situation?" Shaw asked. "Domestic dispute. This woman was interfering, possibly assaulting." Sage's mind raced through legal precedents, de-escalation techniques, and the growing realization that her skin color had predetermined the outcome before anyone had spoken a word. "Officers, I'd like to clarify what actually occurred here." Her tone was measured, professional, the voice she used in Pentagon briefings when delivering intelligence assessments to cabinet-level officials. But here, that same composure was interpreted as defiance. "Ma'am, you need to understand something," Holbrook said, stepping closer with practiced intimidation. "We don't need clarification from you, we need compliance." The word compliance carried weight in this context. Not cooperation, not assistance in establishing facts. Compliance. The language of subjugation rather than partnership in justice. David watched the scene unfold with growing confidence. The system was working exactly as he'd always known it would, protecting him while criminalizing anyone who challenged his behavior. "She just came out of nowhere, officer. Started yelling, getting in my face. I was just trying to have a conversation with my girlfriend." Brooke opened her mouth as if to correct him, then seemed to shrink into herself. The presence of police had changed the dynamic, but not in the way she'd hoped. Sage realized she was watching the American justice system fail in real time. Two trained law enforcement officers were accepting the word of a man who'd been physically intimidating a woman while treating the person who'd tried to help as the primary threat. "Officer, I respectfully request that you take statements from all parties before making any determinations about what occurred." "Ma'am, are you telling me how to do my job?" The question was a trap. Any response would be characterized as either ignorance or insubordination. Sage had navigated similar verbal minefields in congressional hearings, but those had been conducted with cameras rolling and stenographers recording. Here, in a suburban parking lot, there were no such protections. "I'm suggesting that due process would benefit everyone involved." Holbrook's eyes narrowed. Due process was legal terminology, language that suggested education, resources, or worst of all, the kind of knowledge that might lead to complaints and investigations. "Turn around, hands behind your back." On what grounds? Assault, interference with police business, and resisting arrest. The charges materialized like magic, shape-shifting to fit the predetermined narrative. Sage had committed no assault. Holbrook hadn't even alleged she'd touched anyone. She'd interfered with no police business because no police business had been occurring when she arrived. And she couldn't resist arrest until an arrest was attempted. But logic had no place in this transaction. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Sage experienced a profound moment of clarity. She was witnessing the same system she'd sworn to defend being weaponized against her. The uniform she wore in the Pentagon meant nothing here. Her rank, her decorations, her service record invisible. She was just another black woman being processed by a system that had never been designed to protect her. Brooke stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Officers, she was trying to help me. She didn't assault anyone." "Ma'am, please step back. We'll take your statement." But they wouldn't. Sage knew from studying similar cases that Brooke's testimony would be minimized, dismissed, or simply not recorded. The narrative had been established, and contradictory evidence would be treated as inconvenient rather than exonerating. As she was placed in the back of Holbrook's patrol car, Sage caught Brooke's eye through the window. The woman looked stricken, guilty, horrified by how quickly justice had been perverted. David was already walking away, checking his phone, the incident forgotten. He'd never faced consequences for his behavior because the system had provided him with a perfect scapegoat. The patrol car pulled away from Murphy's Cafe, carrying General Sage Cortland toward a confrontation with Judge Bramwell Ashford. Neither man knew they were about to face the full weight of American military justice. But first, they would have their moment of perceived triumph. The Fairfax County Detention Center smelled of industrial disinfectant and institutional hopelessness. Sage sat on the metal bench in Processing Room C, her hands folded in her lap, watching Officer Holbrook complete his arrest report with theatrical diligence. Every few minutes he glanced up at her with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd performed a public service. His partner Shaw seemed less certain, occasionally looking at her with something approaching curiosity. "Full name?" Holbrook asked, his pen poised over the form. "Sage Cortland." "Occupation?" "Government contractor," he snorted. "Right. What kind of government contracting?" The question was designed to expose what he assumed would be a lie. Government contractors in the D.C. area ranged from janitors to aerospace engineers, but his tone suggested he expected the former. Risk assessment and strategic planning. "Uh-huh. For who?" "Department of Defense." Shaw looked up from his own paperwork. Something in her voice, the casual precision with which she delivered the information, didn't match their assumptions about who she was supposed to be. "You got a security clearance?" Shaw asked. Sage paused. Her clearance level was among the highest in the federal government, but revealing that would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Yes." "What level?" Holbrook pressed, clearly expecting to catch her in a fabrication. "Secret." It was technically true. She held secret clearance along with several others that were significantly higher, but secret level was common enough among D.C. area contractors to seem plausible without being impressive. Holbrook made a note, apparently satisfied that he'd confirmed her minimal importance. The booking process continued with fingerprints, photographs, and the confiscation of personal items. Her wallet contained her civilian ID, a credit card, and $200 in cash. Nothing that would contradict her cover story. Hidden in a zippered compartment invisible to casual inspection was her Pentagon ID badge, the badge that would grant her access to floors of the building that most generals never saw. "Personal effects will be returned upon release," the processing sergeant announced, sealing everything in a manila envelope. Sage was moved to a holding cell with 3 other women. 2 were there for minor drug possession, the 3rd for shoplifting. They eyed her with the wary curiosity of people trying to assess a newcomer's place in an improvised hierarchy. "What they get you for?" asked Raven, a woman in her 30s with intricate braids and eyes that had seen too much. "They said assault on a police officer." "Holy cow, you hit a cop?" "I didn't hit anyone. I tried to help someone." Raven studied her face, reading the truth there. "Yeah, that'll do it. Helping while black is a felony in most jurisdictions." The dark humor hit closer to truth than anyone in the cell realized. Hours passed. Sage used the time for mental preparation, running through legal strategies and potential outcomes. Her training had included prisoner of war scenarios, interrogation resistance, and survival in hostile environments. This wasn't a POW camp, but the psychological principles were similar. Maintain dignity. Preserve operational security. Trust the system only as far as evidence and procedure demanded. At 3:15 p.m., a guard appeared at the cell door. "Cortland, your lawyer's here." The conference room was barely large enough for 2 chairs and a small table. The woman who entered looked exhausted in the way that only overworked public defenders achieve. A bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a system designed to crush both her clients and her idealism. "Ms. Cortland, I'm Nova Kensington, your court-appointed attorney." She sat down heavily, dropping a file folder that bulged with too many cases. "I've reviewed the charges against you, and I have to tell you up front. This is a difficult situation." Nova opened the file and scanned the arrest report. "Officer Holbrook claims you assaulted a civilian and then physically resisted when he attempted to arrest you. His partner corroborates the account." "That's not what happened." "I believe you, but unfortunately, what actually happened and what we can prove in court are often different things." Nova's voice carried the weight of experience with such cases. "The system tends to credit police testimony over defendant testimony, particularly when—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she meant. "There were witnesses," Sage said. "The woman I was trying to help, people with phones recording. The victim, a Brooke Whitmore, hasn't been cooperative with our investigation attempts, and phone footage from bystanders often doesn't capture everything. Juries see what they want to see." Nova leaned back in her chair, studying her client. Most people in Sage's position would be panicked, demanding, or belligerent. This woman displayed a calm that was almost unsettling. "Ms. Cortland, can you tell me about your background? Education, work experience, anything that might help humanize you to a jury? I have a degree from West Point." I have worked in government service for 30 years. Nova's pen stopped moving. West Point, you're military? I was military. I work as a contractor now. What kind of military service? Sage had reached the boundary of what she could reveal without compromising operational security. Her service record was classified at multiple levels, her current position even more so. Infantry, then strategic planning. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Officer? Yes. What rank when you discharged? Another carefully calculated truth. Colonel? Nova stared at her. A female colonel with 30 years of service would be incredibly rare, especially one young enough to be sitting in a detention center facing assault charges. Cortland, if you're a retired colonel with a West Point education and 3 decades of military service, why are you working as a contractor instead of enjoying a comfortable retirement? I prefer to stay busy. It wasn't exactly a lie. Sage did prefer to stay busy. Managing 2.1 million service members and coordinating global defense strategy certainly qualified as busy. Nova made notes, her expression thoughtful. This background could help. Military service plays well with juries, especially around here. But I need to ask, is there anything in your service record that the prosecution might use against you? Combat experience sometimes gets twisted into violence training arguments. My record is clean. Any PTSD, anger management issues, anything like that? No. Nova studied her client's face, noting the almost preternatural calm she maintained. Most people facing felony charges showed stress in their posture, their voice, their hand movements. This woman sat like she was attending a briefing. Ms. Cortland, I'm going to be direct with you. Judge Bramwell Ashford is presiding over your case. He's known for harsh sentences, particularly in cases involving alleged violence against police officers. He also has a reputation for being less sympathetic to defendants who don't show what he considers appropriate remorse. What would appropriate remorse look like? Accepting responsibility, showing deference to the court, perhaps agreeing to a plea bargain. Sage considered this. In military justice, accepting responsibility for actions not taken was considered a violation of honor. Civilian courts apparently operated under different principles. And if I maintain my innocence, then we go to trial. And honestly, the odds aren't in our favor. 2 police officers testifying against 1 defendant, a judge who doesn't like challenges to police authority, and a jury pool that tends to trust law enforcement. Nova leaned forward, her voice dropping. Ms. Cortland, I've been doing this for 8 years. I've seen good people destroyed by bad circumstances. If you're willing to consider a plea, I'm not. The response was immediate, final. Nova had heard similar declarations before, usually from defendants whose pride outweighed their pragmatism. But something in this woman's voice suggested a different calculation entirely. May I ask why? Sage looked at her attorney, this overworked woman who was fighting a system designed to defeat her. She thought about the oath she'd taken as a second lieutenant, the promises made to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Because I didn't commit these crimes, and accepting guilt for actions I didn't take would be a betrayal of everything I've sworn to uphold. Nova heard the formality in that response, the language of someone accustomed to speaking about oaths and sworn duties. Most of her clients talked about wanting to avoid jail time or get back to their jobs. This woman talked about betrayal of sworn principles. All right then, we fight. This is exactly why we need to pay attention to what's happening in our justice system. If this can happen to someone this powerful, imagine what happens to ordinary people every day. Share this video to spread awareness about judicial bias. The arraignment was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning in courtroom 4B of the Fairfax County Circuit Court. Judge Bramwell Ashford's domain was a study in intimidation architecture. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an elevated bench that made the judge appear to loom over everyone else in the room. Ashford himself was a 62-year-old man whose 20-year judicial career had been built on the philosophy that harsh sentences prevented future crime. His interpretation of tough on crime had earned him praise from law enforcement organizations and criticism from civil rights groups, a balance he wore as a badge of honor. When Sage entered the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange detention center jumpsuit, Ashford's first impression was immediate and damning. Another defendant who thought the rules didn't apply to them. The defendant will state her name for the record, Ashford commanded after the preliminary proceedings. Sage Cortland, Your Honor. Her voice was clear, respectful, but it carried an undertone that immediately irritated him. There was no trembling, no obvious fear, no deference. This woman was facing felony charges, and she stood like she belonged in his courtroom. Ms. Cortland, you're charged with assault and battery, interference with police duties, and resisting arrest. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Ashford's expression darkened. Guilty pleas moved through his calendar efficiently. Not guilty pleas meant trials, appeals, and complications he didn't appreciate. I see. And you believe you're innocent of these charges? The question was designed to be a trap. Answering yes would sound arrogant. Answering no would contradict the plea. I believe the evidence will show that the charges are not supported by the facts, Your Honor. Nova Kensington winced slightly. Her client was speaking like a legal professional rather than a defendant, using language that suggested education and confidence. In Ashford's courtroom, those qualities in a black defendant often triggered harsh responses. The evidence, Ashford repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. And what evidence would that be, Ms. Cortland? Witness testimony and physical evidence demonstrating that I committed no assault, interfered with no lawful police activity, and offered no resistance to arrest. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Most defendants mumbled through their arraignments, relying on their attorneys to speak for them. This woman was engaging directly with the judge, using precise legal terminology, and showing no apparent intimidation. Ashford leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ms. Cortland, are you an attorney? No, Your Honor. Have you attended law school? No, Your Honor. Then perhaps you should allow your counsel to speak for you rather than offering legal opinions you're unqualified to provide. The reprimand was sharp, designed to put her in her place. But Sage had faced down hostile questioners in congressional hearings where national security was at stake. A small-town judge's attitude was manageable. Of course, Your Honor. Her response was perfectly respectful, but Ashford heard something else, a tone that suggested she was humoring him rather than being genuinely chastened. Nova stepped forward. Your Honor, we request reasonable bail pending trial. Ms. Cortland has no criminal history, strong ties to the community through family, and steady employment. Employment, Ashford mused, consulting his notes. Says here she's a government contractor. What type of government work, Ms. Cortland? Risk assessment and strategic planning, Your Honor. For which agency? Department of Defense, Your Honor. Security clearance? Yes, Your Honor. Ashford made notes, but his expression suggested he viewed these credentials with suspicion rather than respect. In his experience, people who claimed important government jobs were usually exaggerating their actual roles. And what exactly does your risk assessment work involve? Sage hesitated. Truthful answers would require discussing classified information. Vague answers would sound like lies. I analyze potential threats and develop response strategies, Your Honor. Threats to what? National security interests, Your Honor. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sloan Merrick, rose from her table. Your Honor, given the serious nature of these charges, assault on a police officer in particular, the state requests bail be set at $25,000. Nova objected. Your Honor, that's excessive for misdemeanor charges with no criminal history. These aren't just misdemeanors, Ashford corrected. Assault on a police officer is a felony in Virginia, and given the defendant's apparent belief that she's above the law, I'm concerned about flight risk. Your Honor, Nova pressed, Ms. Cortland has family in the area, steady employment, and no passport indicating international travel capabilities. She didn't know, of course, that Sage had 3 different passports for various levels of classified travel, or that she could disappear into any number of federal protection programs with a single phone call. Bail is set at $50,000, Ashford announced with finality. Trial is scheduled for, he consulted his calendar, 1 week from today. This court expects punctuality and respect for proper procedures. His eyes locked on Sage as he spoke, making clear that the warning was directed specifically at her. As the bailiff approached to escort her back to detention, Sage felt the weight of the system closing around her. $50,000 bail for misdemeanor-level charges was punitive, designed to keep her incarcerated rather than ensure her appearance at trial. But she also felt something else, a cold anger at the casual perversion of justice she was witnessing. This was why people lost faith in the system. This was how institutions designed to protect became weapons of oppression. In the detention center transport van, she sat quietly as other defendants complained about their treatment, their lawyers, their chances. She was calculating something entirely different. In 6 days, she was scheduled to brief the president on the NATO summit. In 4 days, advance teams would be arriving in Brussels to prepare for her meetings with defense ministers from 32 nations. Her absence wouldn't just be noticed. It would trigger security protocols designed to locate missing senior officials. But that was still 6 days away. 6 days in a system that had already demonstrated its willingness to ignore evidence and precedent to achieve predetermined outcomes. Court cases can destroy your finances overnight. That's why smart people protect themselves with umbrella insurance from Liberty Mutual. For just pennies a day, you get millions in liability coverage that kicks in when your regular insurance isn't enough. One lawsuit could wipe out everything you've worked for. Don't let that happen. Back in her cell, Sage found herself sharing space with different women than the previous day. The detention center was a revolving door of people caught in various stages of legal processing. Her new cellmate was a woman named Carmen who'd been arrested for driving with a suspended license, a charge that carried potential jail time despite being fundamentally a paperwork issue. First time? Carmen asked, noting Sage's composure. Yes. What they got you for? Assault on a police officer. Carmen whistled low. Heavy charge. You got a good lawyer? I have a public defender. Same thing. They're good people, but they got too many cases. Systems designed to make you take a plea whether you're guilty or not. Carmen had been through the process before, and her cynicism was earned through experience. Judge Ashford? Yes. Oh, honey, he's got a reputation. Doesn't like defendants who don't bow and scrape. Especially doesn't like black women who don't know their place. The phrase, know their place, hung in the air between them. Carmen had articulated what Nova had been too professional to say directly. What's your background? Carmen asked. You talk like you got education. Military service, then government work. Officer? Yes. Carmen studied her with new interest. What rank? Colonel. No fooling. Full bird colonel? Yes. In that case, you better hope somebody at the Pentagon notices you're missing, because Judge Ashford's about to railroad you harder than a freight train. That evening, Sage was allowed one phone call. She could have called the Pentagon's emergency line, could have triggered protocols that would have her released within hours. Instead, she called her sister Maya. Sage, where are you? I expected you back yesterday. I'm in some legal trouble. I need you to contact Nova Kensington at the public defender's office. Tell her you can post bail. Legal trouble? What kind of legal trouble? I was arrested. It's a misunderstanding, but it might take time to resolve. Arrested? For what? They're saying I assaulted a police officer. Maya's silence stretched long enough that Sage wondered if the call had been disconnected. Sage, that's insane. You wouldn't hurt a fly unless national security was at stake. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on either of them. Maya, I need you to not make any calls to Washington. Don't contact anyone from work. This needs to be handled through civilian channels. But surely if they knew who you really are, that's exactly what can't happen. Not yet. Maya understood. Her sister was testing something. The system's ability to deliver justice to an ordinary citizen. Revealing her true identity would shortcut that test, but it would also leave the underlying problems unaddressed. I'll take care of the bail. But Sage, be careful. If this goes wrong, it won't. But as she hung up the phone, Sage wasn't entirely certain that was true. You won't believe what's about to unfold in this courtroom. The next few minutes will expose everything wrong with how we judge people by appearances. Subscribe now because you definitely don't want to miss how this ends. The trial began exactly 1 week later. Judge Ashford had kept his word about punctuality, and the courtroom was packed with an unusual mix of spectators. Word had spread through the local legal community about the difficult defendant who'd challenged Ashford's authority during arraignment. Nova had spent the week investigating, tracking down witnesses, and preparing what she knew would be an uphill battle. Her client remained maddeningly calm, offering strategic insights that seemed far beyond the scope of a typical government contractor. Ms. Cortland, Nova had asked during trial preparation, where did you learn so much about legal procedure? Military justice system. Court-martial procedures share common elements with civilian criminal law. Were you a JAG officer? No, but I've worked with JAG extensively. It was another carefully parsed truth. Sage had worked with JAG extensively. They reported to her. Officer Holbrook took the stand first, delivering his account with practiced confidence. He described a chaotic scene, an aggressive defendant, and his heroic efforts to maintain order and protect public safety. The defendant was yelling, waving her arms, clearly agitated, he testified. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she became belligerent and took an aggressive stance toward me. Did she strike you? The prosecutor asked. She raised her hand as if to strike me, which is when I was forced to subdue her for everyone's safety. Nova's cross-examination revealed subtle inconsistencies, but nothing dramatic enough to undermine the basic narrative. Officer Holbrook, in your report you state that Ms. Cortland was waving her arms. Can you demonstrate what you mean? Holbrook stood and made exaggerated gestures that looked more like a martial arts demonstration than anything a reasonable person would consider threatening. And when you say she took an aggressive stance, what specifically did you observe? She positioned herself between me and the other parties, clearly attempting to interfere with my investigation. Did it occur to you that she might have been trying to provide information about what she'd witnessed? Objection, the prosecutor called. Speculation. Sustained, Ashford ruled. The pattern continued throughout the trial. Ashford sustained prosecution objections while overruling defense objections, gradually building a record that favored the state's version of events. When Brooke Whitmore was called as a witness, she appeared nervous, reluctant, and clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Ms. Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what you observed in the parking lot that day?" "There was an argument between David and me. Then this woman approached and started talking to David." "Did her approach seem threatening to you?" Brooke hesitated. "She seemed calm, actually. She asked if everything was all right. But her intervention escalated the situation." I'm not sure. Everything happened very quickly after the police arrived." Nova's examination of Brooke was more revealing. "Ms. Whitmore, before Ms. Cortland approached, were you in any physical danger?" Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained. "Ms. Whitmore, did Ms. Cortland touch you at any time?" "No." "Did she touch David at any time?" "Not that I saw." "Did she raise her voice or use threatening language toward anyone?" "No, she was actually very polite." When Officer Holbrook arrived, who did he focus his attention on? Her, Ms. Cortland. Did he ask what had happened before he ordered her to step back? Not really. He seemed to assume she was the problem. The prosecutor's redirect focused on Brooke's emotional state, her inability to recall specific details, and the trauma of the situation. By the time she left the stand, her testimony had been effectively neutralized. Judge Ashford watched the proceedings with increasing irritation. The defendant sat calmly beside her attorney, taking notes, occasionally whispering suggestions. Her demeanor suggested confidence rather than appropriate fear. When Nova rested the defense case without calling Sage to testify, Ashford intervened. "Ms. Cortland, do you wish to testify on your own behalf?" It was highly unusual for a judge to directly address a defendant about testifying, but Ashford was clearly hoping to create an opportunity for cross-examination that might break her composure. "No, Your Honor." "Are you certain? This is your opportunity to tell your side of the story." Sage understood the trap. Testifying would open her to questions about her background, her training, her current work, questions that could expose information she wasn't prepared to reveal. "I'm certain, Your Honor." Ashford's disappointment was visible. He'd been looking forward to questioning this woman who'd shown him insufficient deference. Closing arguments followed predictable patterns. The prosecutor painted Sage as an arrogant troublemaker who believed she was above the law. Nova portrayed her as a good Samaritan who'd been criminalized for trying to help. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Nova concluded, "this case isn't about what happened in that parking lot. It's about what we see when we look at people who don't fit our expectations. Ms. Cortland is a decorated military veteran, a government employee with security clearance, a woman who's dedicated her life to serving this country. But in that moment, standing in a parking lot, she was just another black woman who didn't know her place." The prosecutor objected to the racial characterization, but the words had been spoken. Judge Ashford's instructions to the jury were carefully crafted to favor conviction. He emphasized the credibility of police testimony, the seriousness of the charges, and the burden of proof, while subtly undermining the defense's burden to raise reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of assault and battery, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of interference with police duties, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of resisting arrest, how do you find?" "Guilty." Sage felt the words wash over her without visible reaction. She'd expected this outcome from the moment Officer Holbrook had made his assumptions in the parking lot, but she also felt something else, a crystallizing anger at the systematic perversion of justice she'd just experienced. This wasn't about her. This was about every person who'd stood in similar circumstances without the resources or knowledge to fight back. Judge Ashford savored the moment. "Ms. Cortland, you've been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be held tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Bailiff, remand the defendant." As she was led away in handcuffs, Sage caught Nova's eye. Her attorney looked stricken, defeated by a system that had ignored evidence in favor of prejudice. Tomorrow, Ashford would have his opportunity to complete the humiliation. He would sentence her to the maximum penalty allowable by law, believing he was teaching an important lesson about respect and authority. He had no idea that tomorrow would be the last day of his judicial career. Want to understand your rights better? Masterclass offers courses from top legal experts and Supreme Court justices. Learn how the law really works, how to protect yourself, and how to navigate the system like a pro. Use code JUSTICE for 50% off your first year. But first, General Sage Cortland would spend one more night in the Fairfax County Detention Center, calculating exactly how she would dismantle the system that had just failed so spectacularly. The lock clicks twice, then silence. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Judge Bramwell Ashford had arrived early, savoring the anticipation of what he considered his finest moment of judicial authority. The defendant who had dared to challenge him, who had maintained that insufferable composure throughout her trial, would finally learn the cost of disrespecting his courtroom. He'd already decided on the maximum sentence allowable by law, 18 months in state prison, the harshest penalty possible for the combination of charges. It would send a message to other would-be troublemakers about the consequences of challenging authority. Sage sat in the holding cell beneath the courthouse, listening to the sounds of the building coming alive above her. Guards shuffled past, keys jingled, and somewhere in the distance, a phone rang with persistent urgency. She'd spent the night calculating timelines. Her absence from the Pentagon would be noticed today, if it hadn't been already. Emergency protocols would kick in when she failed to appear for her morning intelligence briefing. The machinery of federal security would begin turning, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. But that process would take time. Hours, possibly a full day, before anyone connected her civilian legal troubles with her professional responsibilities. The morning had brought unexpected developments. At 6 a.m., a corrections officer had appeared at her cell with news that rattled even her composure. "Cortland, you got visitors, federal types. Been here since 5 this morning demanding to see you." She'd declined the meeting. Whatever federal interest her case had generated, she wasn't ready to break cover. Not yet. The test of the civilian justice system needed to run its course, regardless of the personal cost. But the knowledge that federal attention was building created a ticking clock. How much longer before her true identity emerged? How much longer before institutional power superseded individual justice? The other women in her cell had noticed the change in energy around her. Guards whispered more urgently. Administrative staff hurried past with unusual frequency. Something was happening, and it centered on the quiet woman who'd spent the night staring at the ceiling with military discipline. "You sure you ain't somebody important?" Raven had asked during the pre-dawn hours. "Feels like Christmas morning around here, way everybody's acting." Sage had deflected the question, but she understood Raven's intuition. The machinery of federal government was beginning to move, slowly but inevitably, toward this small courthouse in suburban Virginia. Nova Kensington appeared at the cell door at 9:30, looking more exhausted than usual. The public defender had spent the night researching appeals procedures, knowing that the sentence Ashford planned to impose would be both excessive and legally challengeable. "Ms. Cortland, I need to prepare you for what's coming. Judge Ashford is going to sentence you to the maximum penalty. I've never seen him show mercy in cases involving police officers." "I understand. I'll file an immediate appeal, but that process can take months. In the meantime," Nova's voice trailed off. She was telling her client that an innocent woman would spend months in prison because the system had failed. "Miss Kensington, I want you to know that you've been an exceptional advocate. None of this reflects on your abilities or your efforts." The words were spoken with such genuine warmth that Nova felt tears prick her eyes. Most clients blamed their lawyers when convictions came down. This woman was offering comfort and support. "There's something else," Nova continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The prosecutor mentioned they've received some unusual inquiries about your case. People asking questions about your background, your employment, that kind of thing." Sage felt a spark of concern. What kind of inquiries? She didn't give details, but Merrick seemed rattled. Said she'd never had federal agencies asking about a simple assault case. FBI apparently, maybe others. The wheels were already turning. Someone at the Pentagon had noticed her absence and begun making quiet inquiries. The question was whether those inquiries would reach the right people in time. "There's more," Nova added, glancing around nervously. "I've been getting calls all morning. Reporters mostly, but also some law enforcement people asking about procedure, jurisdiction, that kind of thing. It's like someone important is taking an interest." "What kind of reporters?" "Washington Post, CNN, even some military publications I'd never heard of. They're asking about you specifically, about the case, about irregularities in the trial." Sage processed this information with growing unease. Media attention meant public scrutiny, which meant her cover story would face serious investigation. How long before someone connected the dots between her arrest and her absence from Pentagon briefings? "Ms. Kensington, I need you to handle any media requests carefully. Don't provide information beyond public record. Don't speculate about my background or circumstances." "Of course, but..." Nova hesitated. "Ms. Cortland, is there something you need to tell me? Something that might help your case?" The question hung in the air between them. Sage could end this entire ordeal with a single phone call. Could reveal her identity and watch as federal power demolished the local conspiracy that had railroaded her. Could transform herself from victim to victor in minutes. but doing so would accomplish nothing beyond her personal vindication. The system that had failed her would continue failing others, hidden behind the excuse of a unique situation involving a high-ranking official. "There's nothing to tell," she said quietly. "We proceed as planned." Nova studied her client's face, recognizing both truth and omission in that statement. There was definitely something this woman wasn't revealing, but she seemed determined to face whatever consequences came without using whatever hidden resources she possessed. At 9:55, Sage was escorted to the courtroom for what Judge Ashford intended to be his moment of supreme triumph. The walk through the courthouse corridors felt different this morning. More eyes tracking her movement, more whispered conversations, more sense of anticipation that went beyond a routine sentencing hearing. The gallery was fuller than usual. Word had spread through the legal community about the harsh sentence Ashford planned to impose, and several attorneys had come to witness what many considered judicial misconduct in real time. But there were other faces too. Men and women in conservative suits who watched the proceedings with the intense focus of people whose interest went beyond professional curiosity. Speaking of legal protection, have you ever wondered if you could defend yourself better in court? Legal Shield offers 24/7 access to attorneys for less than $1 a day. Whether it's traffic tickets, identity theft, or family matters, you'll have professional legal consultation at your fingertips. Don't wait until you need it. Get protected now with Legal Shield. All rise for the Honorable Judge Bramwell Ashford. Ashford swept into the courtroom with theatrical dignity, his black robes billowing, his expression set in lines of righteous authority. This was his kingdom, and today he would demonstrate the absolute nature of his power. But as he took his seat, his eyes swept the gallery and noted the unusual composition of the audience. Too many serious faces, too many people taking notes, too many observers who didn't look like typical courthouse regulars. "Be seated. We are here for sentencing in the matter of Commonwealth versus Sage Cortland." He looked down at the defendant with undisguised satisfaction, but something in the air felt different. Charged. Dangerous. "Ms. Cortland, yesterday a jury of your peers found you guilty on all counts. Today this court will impose sentence." Sage stood beside Nova, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that had been drilled into her through decades of military service. To Ashford, her stance looked defiant. To anyone with military experience, it looked like attention. In the gallery, one of the observers, a woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, leaned forward as she recognized that posture. Military bearing was unmistakable once you knew what to look for, and this defendant carried herself like someone who'd spent years in uniform. "Before imposing sentence," Ashford continued, his voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before, "this court wishes to address the defendant's conduct throughout these proceedings. From the moment you entered my courtroom, Ms. Cortland, you have shown a complete lack of respect for the law, for law enforcement, and for this court's authority." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. This level of personal commentary during sentencing was unusual even for Ashford, and the tension in the room was becoming palpable. Outside the courtroom, federal vehicles had begun arriving in the courthouse parking lot. Black SUVs with government plates, their occupants remaining seated but ready. The local sheriff's department had been quietly notified that federal law enforcement was taking an interest in the proceedings, though the nature of that interest remained unclear. "Your crime was not merely an assault on Officer Holbrook," Ashford continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. "It was an assault on the very concept of law and order. Your attitude during trial, your refusal to show appropriate remorse, your apparent belief that you are somehow above the consequences that apply to everyone else, demonstrates a fundamental lack of character." Nova started to object to the personal attack, but Ashford silenced her with a raised hand. The gesture was more aggressive than necessary, and several observers made notes. "Your military service, which your counsel highlighted during trial, makes your conduct even more reprehensible. As a veteran, you should understand better than most the importance of following orders, respecting authority, and maintaining discipline. Instead, you have chosen to believe that your service entitles you to special treatment." The irony was staggering. Ashford was lecturing her about military discipline while demonstrating his own complete ignorance of what military service actually meant. In the gallery, the silver-haired woman was now making urgent phone calls, her voice low, but her expression increasingly alarmed. The courthouse security chief appeared at the back of the courtroom, spoke briefly with one of the federal observers, then hurried out again. Something was escalating beyond the normal rhythm of judicial proceedings. "Therefore, this court sentences you as follows. On the charge of assault and battery, 18 months in the state penitentiary. On the charge of interference with police duties, 12 months in the state penitentiary. on the charge of resisting arrest, 6 months in the state penitentiary. These sentences to run consecutively for a total of 36 months incarceration. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The sentence was not just harsh, it was vindictive, disproportionate, and clearly designed as punishment for Sage's refusal to grovel before Ashford's authority. Additionally, upon release, you will serve 5 years of supervised probation and pay a fine of $10,000. You are also ordered to complete anger management counseling and community service. Nova was on her feet instantly. Your Honor, this sentence is grossly excessive for these charges. We respectfully request— Your request is denied. The sentence stands. Ashford's gavel rose, poised for the thunderous blow that would seal Sage's fate. In that moment, as the gavel began its descent, Sage felt a profound sense of completion. The test was finished. The system had revealed its true nature, had demonstrated its willingness to pervert justice in service of prejudice and power. But she also felt something else. The subtle vibration of her secure communication device, hidden in her shoe, indicating that federal protocols had finally been triggered. The cavalry was coming, though whether they would arrive in time remained to be seen. That's when the courtroom doors exploded open. Court cases can destroy your finances overnight. That's why smart people protect themselves with umbrella insurance from Liberty Mutual. For just pennies a day, you get millions in liability coverage that kicks in when your regular insurance isn't enough. One lawsuit could wipe out everything you've worked for. Don't let that happen. Nova Kensington appeared at the cell door at 9:30, looking more exhausted than usual. The public defender had spent the night researching appeals procedures, knowing that the sentence Ashford planned to impose would be both excessive and legally challengeable. Ms. Cortland, I need to prepare you for what's coming. Judge Ashford is going to sentence you to the maximum penalty. I've never seen him show mercy in cases involving police officers. I understand. I'll file an immediate appeal, but that process can take months. In the meantime, Nova's voice trailed off. She was telling her client that an innocent woman would spend months in prison because the system had failed. Ms. Kensington, I want you to know that you've been an exceptional advocate. None of this reflects on your abilities or your efforts. The words were spoken with such genuine warmth that Nova felt tears prick her eyes. Most clients blamed their lawyers when convictions came down. This woman was offering comfort and support. There's something else, Nova continued. The prosecutor mentioned they've received some unusual inquiries about your case. People asking questions about your background, your employment, that kind of thing. Sage felt a spark of concern. What kind of inquiries? She didn't give details, but Merrick seemed rattled. Said she'd never had federal agencies asking about a simple assault case. The wheels were already turning. Someone at the Pentagon had noticed her absence and begun making quiet inquiries. The question was whether those inquiries would reach the right people in time. At 9:55, Sage was escorted to the courtroom for what Judge Ashford intended to be his moment of supreme triumph. The gallery was fuller than usual. Word had spread through the legal community about the harsh sentence Ashford planned to impose, and several attorneys had come to witness what many considered judicial misconduct in real time. All rise for the Honorable Judge Bramwell Ashford. Ashford swept into the courtroom with theatrical dignity, his black robes billowing, his expression set in lines of righteous authority. This was his kingdom, and today he would demonstrate the absolute nature of his power. Be seated. We are here for sentencing in the matter of Commonwealth versus Sage Cortland. He looked down at the defendant with undisguised satisfaction. Ms. Cortland, yesterday a jury of your peers found you guilty on all counts. Today this court will impose sentence. Sage stood beside Nova, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that had been drilled into her through decades of military service. To Ashford, her stance looked defiant. To anyone with military experience, it looked like attention. Before imposing sentence, Ashford continued, this court wishes to address the defendant's conduct throughout these proceedings. From the moment you entered my courtroom, Ms. Cortland, you have shown a complete lack of respect for the law, for law enforcement, and for this court's authority. He paused, letting his words sink in. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. This level of personal commentary during sentencing was unusual, even for Ashford. Your crime was not merely an assault on Officer Holbrook. It was an assault on the very concept of law and order. Your attitude during trial, your refusal to show appropriate remorse, your apparent belief that you are somehow above the consequences that apply to everyone else, demonstrates a fundamental lack of character. Nova started to object to the personal attack, but Ashford silenced her with a raised hand. Your military service, which your counsel highlighted during trial, makes your conduct even more reprehensible. As a veteran, you should understand better than most the importance of following orders, respecting authority, and maintaining discipline. Instead, you have chosen to believe that your service entitles you to special treatment. The irony was staggering. Ashford was lecturing her about military discipline while demonstrating his own complete ignorance of what military service actually meant. Therefore, this court sentences you as follows. On the charge of assault and battery, 18 months in the state penitentiary. On the charge of interference with police duties, 12 months in the state penitentiary. On the charge of resisting arrest, 6 months in the state penitentiary. These sentences to run consecutively, for a total of 36 months incarceration. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The sentence was not just harsh. It was vindictive, disproportionate, and clearly designed as punishment for Sage's refusal to grovel before Ashford's authority. Additionally, upon release, you will serve 5 years of supervised probation and pay a fine of $10,000. You are also ordered to complete anger management counseling and community service. Nova was on her feet instantly. Your Honor, this sentence is grossly excessive for these charges. We respectfully request. Your request is denied. The sentence stands. Ashford's gavel rose, poised for the thunderous blow that would seal Sage's fate. That's when the courtroom doors exploded open. The sound was like a thunderclap, so sudden and violent that everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Ashford, froze in shock. The heavy oak doors had been thrown open with such force that they slammed against the walls, the impact reverberating through the chamber. 3 figures strode through the doorway with military precision. The woman leading them wore the dress blue uniform of an army colonel, her chest decorated with rows of ribbons that spoke of combat service and high-level assignments. Her bearing was ramrod straight, her expression granite hard, and her eyes blazed with cold fury. Behind her marched 2 men in identical uniforms, a major and a captain, both carrying leather briefcases and moving with the synchronized precision of an elite honor guard. Their faces were masks of professional control, but something in their posture radiated barely contained power. Judge Ashford's gavel hung suspended in midair, forgotten. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process what was happening in his sanctum. The lead officer, her nameplate read Sheffield, marched directly down the center aisle, her polished shoes clicking against the floor like gunshots. She didn't slow, didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the stunned faces turning to track her movement. She stopped directly in front of the clerk's desk, 3 feet from Judge Ashford's bench, and spoke in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade. My name is Colonel Wren Sheffield, United States Army, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I am acting under direct orders from the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. People leaned forward, straining to understand what they were witnessing. Ashford found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. What is the meaning of this? This is a court of law. You have no authority here. Colonel Sheffield ignored him completely. She opened her briefcase with 2 sharp clicks and withdrew a thick document bound in navy blue leather, emblazoned with the official seal of the Department of Defense. This is a federal writ of habeas corpus, signed by a United States District Court judge, ordering the immediate release of a federal employee being held in violation of constitutional protections and federal law. She placed the document on the clerk's desk with enough force to make the man jump backward. You're talking nonsense, Ashford sputtered, his face turning red. There are no federal employees in my courtroom. There's only a convicted criminal who— Your Honor, Sheffield's voice cut through his protests like ice. You are mistaken. She turned slowly to face him, and the look in her eyes was pure, concentrated authority. When she spoke again, her voice filled every corner of the courtroom. The woman you have just sentenced is not a convicted criminal. The woman you have placed in restraints is General Sage Cortland, United States Army, currently serving as Deputy Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recipient of the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Purple Heart. The words detonated in the courtroom like grenades. People gasped, whispered, stared in shock at the woman in the orange jumpsuit who stood with impossible calm at the defendant's table. Ashford's face went through a spectrum of colors, red to pale to gray to a sickly green. His mouth moved wordlessly as his brain tried to process information that contradicted everything he'd assumed. That's impossible, he whispered. She's what, Your Honor? Sheffield's voice was dangerously quiet. A government contractor? She is. Her duties involve contracting with foreign governments on behalf of the United States military. She's currently supposed to be in Brussels finalizing a NATO defense agreement that affects the security of 32 nations. Sheffield took a step closer to the bench, her eyes locked on Ashford's. An agreement that is now in jeopardy because one of America's highest-ranking military officers is sitting in your courtroom in shackles, convicted on the perjured testimony of a local police officer who couldn't be bothered to investigate what actually happened before making arrests. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the rapid, panicked breathing of Judge Bramwell Ashford as his world collapsed around him. Nova Kensington stared at her client in stunned comprehension. Every anomaly from the past week suddenly made perfect sense. The impossible composure, the detailed knowledge of legal procedure, the precise military bearing, the way she'd spoken about oaths and sworn duties. Officer Holbrook, who'd been sitting in the gallery to witness his triumph, had gone white as paper. His hands shook as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. He'd arrested one of the most powerful people in the American military because she was black, and he'd assumed she was the threat. District Attorney Sloan Merrick looked like she was going to vomit. Her career-making case had just become a career-ending disaster of historic proportions. Sheffield continued her devastating assault on the court's credibility. General Cortlandt was in McLean on personal leave, 72 hours of vacation time before departing for the NATO summit. She witnessed a domestic violence incident and intervened to protect a civilian using minimal force consistent with her training and legal authority. She opened her briefcase again and withdrew a second document. This is a sworn affidavit from Brooke Whitmore, the victim of that domestic violence, stating clearly that General Cortlandt intervened on her behalf and committed no assault of any kind. Ms. Whitmore was intimidated into providing unclear testimony by investigators who had predetermined the outcome they wanted. Another document emerged from the briefcase. This is digital forensic analysis of cell phone footage from the scene, clearly showing that General Cortlandt made no aggressive moves toward anyone and was arrested while attempting to provide information to responding officers. Document after document hit the clerk's desk with machine gun precision. Security camera footage from the restaurant showing the domestic violence incident that prompted General Cortlandt's intervention. Radio transcripts showing that Officer Holbrook requested backup for aggressive black female before he'd even spoken to anyone at the scene. Internal affairs reports documenting 17 previous complaints against Officer Holbrook for racial profiling. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of everything that had just transpired. And finally, Sheffield's voice rose to fill the courtroom, this is a formal complaint filed with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, documenting systematic violations of constitutional rights by this court, this police department, and the prosecutor's office. She turned her attention back to Judge Ashford, who sat frozen in his chair like a deer caught in headlights. Your Honor, in the past week, you have illegally denied constitutional protections to a sitting general of the United States Army. You have allowed perjured testimony to stand without investigation. You have imposed excessive bail designed to punish rather than ensure appearance. You have conducted a trial that violated every principle of due process. And you have just attempted to sentence an innocent woman to 3 years in prison for the crime of helping a domestic violence victim. The major who'd accompanied Sheffield stepped forward and spoke for the first time. Sir, the FBI is currently executing search warrants on this courthouse, the police station, and the prosecutor's office. Every case file, every email, every phone record is being seized for federal investigation. The captain added his own devastating news. The Inspector General of the Department of Justice is en route from Washington to conduct a comprehensive review of civil rights violations in this jurisdiction. The investigation will examine every conviction, every sentence, and every plea bargain processed through this court for the past 5 years. Judge Ashford finally found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. I didn't know. How could I have known? Sheffield's response was surgical in its precision. Your Honor, you didn't know because you didn't want to know. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions. When those assumptions were challenged by evidence, you ignored the evidence. When legal procedures demanded fairness, you perverted those procedures. When justice required humility, you chose arrogance. She gestured toward Sage, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation. That woman has dedicated her life to defending the Constitution you swore to uphold. She has commanded troops in combat, advised presidents, and sacrificed more for this country than you could possibly imagine. And you tried to destroy her because she didn't show you the deference you believed you deserved. Sheffield turned to the 2 bailiffs who stood paralyzed beside Sage. Remove those restraints. Now. The bailiffs looked desperately toward Ashford for guidance, but the judge sat motionless. His authority evaporated. Those restraints will be removed, Sheffield continued, or federal marshals will remove them. Your choice. One bailiff, his hands shaking, fumbled for his keys. The metallic sound of handcuffs being unlocked seemed impossibly loud in the silent courtroom. As the steel restraints fell away from her wrists, Sage rubbed the marks they'd left behind. It was a small gesture, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. A moment of dignity reclaimed after a week of systematic humiliation. Sheffield opened her briefcase one final time and withdrew a document that made several people in the gallery gasp. This is a presidential commendation signed this morning, recognizing General Cortland's exemplary service and condemning the treatment she has received. The President of the United States has personally reviewed this case and expressed his complete confidence in General Cortland's character and judgment. She held the document up for everyone to see. The President has also directed that this case be used as a template for reforming civilian law enforcement's interaction with military personnel and federal employees. General Cortland's experience will become the foundation for new training programs, new oversight mechanisms, and new accountability measures. Nova Kensington stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. Your Honor, in light of these revelations, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges and a complete reversal of the conviction. But Sheffield held up her hand. Counselor, that motion is unnecessary. Federal jurisdiction supersedes state jurisdiction in this matter. All charges are hereby dismissed under federal authority. The conviction is vacated, and General Cortland is released into federal custody. She turned to face the gallery, addressing the room full of stunned observers. Let this be a lesson to everyone present. Justice is not about the power of judges or the authority of prosecutors. Justice is about the equal application of law regardless of race, gender, appearance, or social status. When that equality fails, the federal government will intervene to restore it. Judge Ashford made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his authority. This is highly irregular. Federal courts cannot simply override state convictions without proper appeals procedures. Colonel Sheffield's smile was cold as winter. Your Honor, federal courts can and will override state convictions when those convictions violate federal law. The Civil Rights Act, the Equal Protection Clause, and federal statutes protecting military personnel all supersede your state authority. She paused, letting that sink in. And Your Honor, as of this moment, you are suspended from all judicial duties pending federal investigation. Please remove your robe. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. No one had ever seen a federal officer demand a sitting judge remove his robes in open court. Ashford's hands trembled as he reached for the zipper of his judicial robe. In front of dozens of witnesses, cameras that had somehow appeared, and the woman whose life he'd tried to destroy, he slowly removed the black garment that had represented his authority. Without the robe, he looked small, old, and utterly defeated. That was just one case of hidden identity justice. Wait until you hear about the homeless veteran who turned out to be a billionaire's son, or the janitor who was secretly a federal judge. Hit the bell icon for more shocking reveals. As Judge Ashford's robe hit the bench with a soft thud, the true magnitude of the transformation became clear. The man who had wielded absolute authority minutes earlier now sat exposed as nothing more than a petty tyrant whose power had evaporated in the face of real justice. Colonel Sheffield walked to the defense table where General Sage Cortland stood with quiet dignity. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Sheffield's military bearing softened slightly. "Ma'am," she said, her voice dropping to a respectful tone that carried clearly through the silent room. "I apologize for the delay. When you missed your morning briefing, it took several hours to trace your location through civilian systems." Sage nodded slightly. "Colonel Sheffield, I assume the NATO preparatory meetings are proceeding on schedule?" "Yes, ma'am. Secretary Austin sends his regards and asks that you contact him immediately upon your release. The Brussels delegation is standing by for your arrival." The exchange was conducted in the calm, professional tones of military colleagues discussing operational details. But to everyone else in the courtroom, it was a surreal demonstration of just how far outside their understanding this situation had moved. Nova Kensington approached her former client, her expression a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "General Cortland, I had no idea. If I had known..." Sage turned to face her attorney, and for the first time that day, her expression warmed with genuine affection. "Ms. Kensington, you were extraordinary. You believed in my innocence when I was nothing more than a name in a case file. You fought for justice when the system was designed to prevent it. You have my deepest gratitude and respect." She extended her hand and Nova shook it with something approaching reverence. "You didn't reveal your identity," Nova whispered. "Why?" "Because justice shouldn't require a general's stars to function properly. What happened to me happens to others every day. People who don't have the Pentagon to rescue them. The system failed, and that failure needed to be documented. The weight of that statement settled over the courtroom like a blanket. This hadn't been about one woman's legal troubles. It had been a test of American justice. A test the system had failed spectacularly. Officer Holbrook, who had been sitting in frozen horror since Sheffield's arrival, suddenly stood and began moving toward the exit. But the captain who'd accompanied Sheffield stepped into his path. "Officer Holbrook, you're under arrest for perjury, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deny constitutional protections under federal law." Holbrook's face went from pale to gray. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know she was—" "You didn't know because you didn't investigate. You made assumptions based on race and acted on those assumptions without regard for evidence or truth." Federal marshals appeared as if from nowhere, flanking Holbrook as the captain read him his rights. The man who had started this entire chain of events was now being processed through the same system he'd used to victimize others. District Attorney Sloan Merrick had been sitting in stunned silence, but now she approached Colonel Sheffield with desperate urgency. "Colonel, I want to make it clear that this office was simply following proper procedures. We prosecuted based on the evidence provided by law enforcement." "Ms. Merrick," Sheffield interrupted, "you prosecuted based on evidence you knew was questionable while suppressing evidence that contradicted your case. The federal investigation will determine the extent of your office's culpability." Merrick's career ambitions crumbled visibly. The case she'd hoped would establish her reputation had instead exposed her willingness to pursue convictions regardless of truth. As federal agents began securing documents and evidence from the courtroom, Sage found herself approached by several people she'd never expected to see again. Brooke Whitmore had been sitting in the back of the gallery, having been summoned as a witness for what everyone assumed would be routine sentencing. Now she pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face. "General Cortland, I'm so sorry. They told me that if I testified clearly about what happened, it would hurt your case. They said the best thing I could do was be vague, let the system work. I believed them." Sage's expression showed no anger, only understanding. "Ms. Whitmore, you were a victim being manipulated by people in positions of authority. That's not your fault. It's theirs. But if I had told the truth wouldn't have mattered to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Your testimony was just one piece of a much larger pattern." Brooke looked at this woman who had suffered enormously for trying to help her, who was now offering forgiveness instead of blame. "Is there anything I can do? Anything to make this right?" "Yes," Sage replied. "When this becomes public, and it will, tell your story truthfully. Help people understand how the system failed. That's how we prevent it from happening again." Carmen, her former cellmate, had somehow gained access to the courtroom and was standing nearby with an expression of amazement. "Holy cow," she whispered. "I knew you were different, but a general, the deputy chairman? How the hell did you end up in county lockup?" "Same way anyone else does," Sage replied with a slight smile. "I was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong skin color." Carmen laughed, but it was the bitter laughter of someone who understood that truth all too well. "Least now maybe something will change. Maybe the next person who gets railroaded will have better luck. That's the goal." Colonel Sheffield approached with a secure phone. "Ma'am, the secretary is holding for you." Sage took the phone and walked a few steps away for privacy. The conversation was brief, conducted in the clipped tones of military efficiency, but everyone in the room could sense its importance. When she returned the phone, Sheffield briefed her on the immediate situation. "Ma'am, federal investigators are already reviewing case files from this jurisdiction. They've identified 17 cases with similar patterns. Defendants of color receiving disproportionate sentences for minor charges, often after trials with procedural irregularities. And Officer Holbrook? Part of a pattern. His arrest record shows clear racial bias in stops, searches, and arrests. Internal Affairs had documented complaints but failed to act. The judge? Under federal investigation for civil rights violations. He'll likely face criminal charges along with removal from office." Sage nodded, processing the information with the same analytical calm she brought to military intelligence briefings. "Colonel, I want a comprehensive review of civilian law enforcement interactions with military personnel. This can't be an isolated incident." "Already in progress, ma'am. The Pentagon is coordinating with Justice on a nationwide analysis." "Good. And I want those 17 cases reviewed by federal prosecutors. If convictions were obtained through similar misconduct, they need to be overturned." "Yes, ma'am." The efficiency with which federal authority was being brought to bear on local corruption was breathtaking. In less than an hour, an entire system of injustice was being dismantled with surgical precision. Judge Ashford, still sitting at his bench in shirt sleeves, made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. General Cortland, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know that if I had known who you were. Sage turned to face him, her expression neutral but her words devastating. Your Honor, that statement encapsulates everything wrong with this situation. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. But justice is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be the same for everyone, regardless of rank or race or social status. She paused, letting her words sink in. The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you treated a human being as less than human because of assumptions based on prejudice. That's not justice. That's oppression with a gavel. Ashford had no response. There was no response that could address the fundamental truth of her statement. As federal agents continued their work, Sage found herself surrounded by reporters who had somehow gained access to the courthouse. Questions flew at her from all directions. General, what will happen to your NATO responsibilities? Ma'am, will you be pressing federal charges? General, do you see this as part of a larger pattern of military-civilian tensions? Colonel Sheffield immediately moved to shield her from the media onslaught. General Cortland will not be making statements at this time. All inquiries should be directed through Pentagon Public Affairs. But Sage held up her hand, indicating she wanted to address the press briefly. I'll say this. What happened here wasn't about me personally. It was about a system that failed to live up to its own principles. My rank and my position eventually provided protection that allowed justice to prevail. But thousands of Americans face similar injustices every day without that protection. She looked directly into the cameras. Real reform requires acknowledging that equal justice under law means equal justice for everyone, not just for people with stars on their shoulders or titles after their names. That's the work we need to do as a nation. With that, she allowed Sheffield to escort her from the courtroom, leaving behind a scene of controlled chaos as federal agents continued their investigation. The Pentagon's river entrance was bustling with its usual morning activity when General Sage Cortland's motorcade arrived at 7:30 a.m., exactly 12 hours after her release from the Fairfax County Courthouse. She wore her dress blue uniform with the 4 stars that marked her as one of the most senior officers in the American military. To the Marines standing guard, to the civilian employees hurrying to work, to the tourists gathering for the first Pentagon tour of the day, she looked like exactly what she was. A general arriving for another day of managing America's defense. None of them could have imagined that 18 hours earlier, she'd been wearing an orange jumpsuit and facing 3 years in prison for crimes she hadn't committed. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was waiting in the secure conference room on the 4th floor, along with General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a collection of the Pentagon's most senior leaders. Their expressions ranged from relief to fury to bewilderment. Sage, Secretary Austin said as she entered the room. Are you all right? I'm fine, sir. Ready to proceed with NATO preparations. The hell with NATO preparations, General Milley interjected. Do you have any idea what almost happened? We came within hours of losing our deputy chairman to a local criminal justice system run by idiots and bigots. Sage took her seat at the conference table, her expression calm despite the chaos her absence had caused. Sir, with respect, that's exactly why this needed to happen. The room fell silent. Several of the most powerful people in American government stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Explain that, Austin said quietly. Mr. Secretary, what happened to me happens to Americans every day. The only difference is that I have institutional protection that most people don't. If the system had worked properly, if officers had investigated before arresting, if prosecutors had sought truth instead of convictions, if judges had applied law instead of prejudice, my rank never would have mattered. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the intensity she reserved for the most critical briefings. But the system didn't work. It failed at every level, in ways that would have destroyed an ordinary citizen's life completely. The question isn't why this happened to me. The question is how often it happens to people who don't have the Pentagon to rescue them. General Milley nodded slowly. And now we know the answer to that question. Yes, sir. The DOJ's preliminary review has identified similar cases in 17 states. Systematic bias in arrest patterns, prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias. It's not isolated, it's endemic. Austin pulled out a folder marked with the highest classification markings. Sage, the President has asked me to brief you on the federal response. This goes beyond criminal justice reform. It's becoming a national security issue. He opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Foreign intelligence services have been monitoring American civil rights cases for years, looking for evidence of systemic discrimination they can use for propaganda purposes. Your case is exactly the kind of incident they use to undermine American credibility internationally. Meaning? Meaning that when the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs can be illegally imprisoned by local authorities, it sends a message about American institutions that our enemies are eager to exploit. A new voice entered the conversation from the secure video screen mounted on the wall. Attorney General Merrick Garland appeared, speaking from his office in the Justice Department. General Cortland, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. The federal investigation is proceeding rapidly, and we expect to file criminal charges against multiple officials within the week. Thank you, sir. What about the other cases? We're reviewing every conviction obtained by Judge Ashford over the past 5 years. So far, we've identified 43 cases with similar procedural violations, almost all involving defendants of color facing disproportionate sentences. The scale of the corruption was staggering. 43 lives potentially destroyed by a system that had prioritized prejudice over justice. And Officer Holbrook? Already in federal custody, we've identified a pattern of misconduct stretching back years. Multiple complaints, suppressed evidence, coordinated false testimony with other officers. He's looking at serious federal time. The prosecutor? Sloan Merrick is cooperating with our investigation in exchange for consideration in her own case. She's admitted to suppressing exculpatory evidence in multiple trials. Austin closed the classified folder. Sage, the president wants to use your experience as the foundation for comprehensive criminal justice reform. New oversight mechanisms, federal monitoring of local courts, enhanced protection for civil rights. What would that involve? You'd be leading a joint Pentagon Justice Task Force, working directly with the White House on policy development. It would mean stepping back from some of your current NATO responsibilities. Sage considered the offer. Leading a task force on civil rights would mean fewer hours managing global military strategy and more time dealing with the messy, frustrating work of domestic reform. I'll do it, she said without hesitation. The decision surprised some of the people in the room. Most general officers preferred high-profile military assignments to domestic policy work. Why? Austin asked. Because this is what I swore an oath to defend, sir. The Constitution doesn't just apply overseas. It applies in parking lots in suburban Virginia, in county jails, in local courtrooms. If we can't protect those principles at home, we have no business promoting them abroad. 3 weeks later, the Sage Cortland Federal Justice Initiative was announced at a White House ceremony attended by civil rights leaders, military officials, and the families of people who'd been victimized by the same system that had failed her. Brooke Whitmore was there, having become an unexpected advocate for domestic violence victims and police accountability. She'd testified before Congress about how victim intimidation was used to suppress evidence in criminal cases. Nova Kensington had been promoted to Chief Public Defender for Northern Virginia and was using her newfound visibility to highlight the resource constraints that forced dedicated attorneys to handle impossible caseloads. Carmen, her former cellmate, had been hired as a community liaison for the new federal oversight program, using her street-level experience to help identify cases that might otherwise slip through the cracks. Even Maya, Sage's sister, had become involved, hosting community forums about civil rights in suburban communities where such issues were often ignored. But not everyone had embraced the changes. Judge Bramwell Ashford had been indicted on federal civil rights charges and faced up to 10 years in prison. His judicial career was over, his reputation destroyed, his pension suspended. He'd become a cautionary tale told in law schools about the dangers of prejudice and the abuse of power. Officer Trent Holbrook had pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges and was serving a 5-year sentence in federal prison. His testimony had helped expose a network of officers who had coordinated false testimony in dozens of cases. District Attorney Sloan Merrick had resigned in disgrace, her law license suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Her cooperation with federal investigators had revealed systematic misconduct in the prosecutor's office, stretching back years. The broader impact was harder to measure, but no less significant. Police departments across the country had implemented new training programs on implicit bias and de-escalation. Federal monitors had been assigned to courts with patterns of discriminatory sentencing. The Justice Department had launched investigations in 12 additional jurisdictions with similar problems. But perhaps the most important change was subtler, a shift in how Americans thought about justice and equality. Sage's case had become a touchstone for discussions about privilege, prejudice, and the gap between American ideals and American reality. 6 months after her arrest, General Sage Cortland stood at the podium in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing reporters about the progress of the Federal Justice Initiative. Reform is slow work, she said, responding to a question about whether enough had been accomplished. Changing systems requires changing minds, and changing minds requires changing hearts. but we're making progress. General, called a reporter from the back of the room, do you ever regret not revealing your identity earlier? You could have avoided the entire ordeal. Sage paused, considering the question. It was one she'd been asked repeatedly over the past months. If I had revealed my identity, I would have received different treatment, but the system's fundamental problems would have remained unchanged. Sometimes you have to experience injustice personally to understand how to fight it effectively. She looked directly into the cameras. Every day, Americans face the kind of treatment I experienced. People who don't have institutional protection, who don't have federal agencies to rescue them, who don't have media attention to shame authorities into accountability. The question isn't whether I should have been treated better because of my rank. The question is why anyone should be treated the way I was treated. Another reporter called out, "What's next for the initiative?" We're expanding federal oversight to include civilian contractors working with the military, developing new protocols for cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and creating rapid response teams for civil rights violations involving federal personnel. And personally, General, what's next for you? Sage smiled slightly. It was a question that touched on something she'd been considering for weeks. I'm a soldier. Soldiers go where they're needed, when they're needed. Right now, I'm needed here, working on this mission. When that changes, I'll adapt accordingly. But as she left the briefing room, Sage carried with her a manila folder marked classified, eyes only. Inside were intelligence reports that had been crossing her desk with increasing frequency over the past month. The reports detailed a disturbing pattern. Military personnel across the country were reporting incidents similar to hers, arrests, harassment, and legal troubles that seemed to correlate with their service records and security clearances. Someone was targeting American military officers. Someone with access to personnel files, travel schedules, and operational information. Someone who understood that creating legal problems for key military leaders could destabilize American defense capabilities without firing a shot. Her own arrest, which had seemed like random prejudice, was starting to look like something more deliberate. That evening, in her Pentagon office, Sage received a secure phone call that would change everything she thought she understood about her ordeal. General Cortland, this is Director Burns from CIA. I need to brief you on something that relates to your recent legal difficulties. I'm listening. Ma'am, we've identified what appears to be a coordinated campaign targeting senior military personnel through manipulation of civilian law enforcement. Your case wasn't random. It was orchestrated. By whom? That's what we're trying to determine. But General, we need to talk in person, tonight. There are some things you need to see. As Sage hung up the phone, she looked out her office window at the Potomac River, where the lights of Washington, D.C. reflected off the dark water. She'd thought her ordeal was over, that justice had been served and reforms were in place. Instead, it seemed like it had been just the beginning. Her arrest in that parking lot hadn't been the random result of prejudice and incompetence. It had been the opening move in a campaign against American military leadership, a campaign that was still ongoing. The phone on her desk rang again, displaying the direct number for the Secretary of Defense. Sage, we need you back here tonight. Emergency briefing. Bring everything from your arrest file. Every document, every piece of evidence, every detail you can remember. Sir, what's happening? We think someone's been using local police departments to target our people. And if we're right, your case was just the test run. As General Sage Cortland gathered her files and prepared to return to the Pentagon for what promised to be a very long night, her secure email chimed with a new message from an encrypted account she didn't recognize. The message contained a single line of text. The general wasn't our only target. Attached was a list of names, 23 senior military officers, all of whom had experienced legal troubles, arrests, or harassment by civilian authorities in the past 18 months. All of whom had one thing in common. They held key positions in America's most sensitive defense operations. The lock clicks twice, then silence. As she drove through the Virginia night toward the Pentagon, General Sage Cortland realized that her fight for justice was about to become a fight for national security. Someone was waging war against American military leadership, using the justice system as their weapon, and now it was her job to stop them. The story was far from over.